This is Yahweh.
Satanic! Hail, Satan! Hail, Satan! Hail, Satan!
Greetings, heathens. Welcome to Hail Satan. This is the podcast exploring Satanism, culture, and life in general through the eyes of modern Satanists. My name is Joseph Rose. I'm a member of an independent congregation called Satanic Delco, and I'm also a member of the Satanic Temple. Today, I'm going to speak with Dr. Hannah Bland. She is a mental health professional, and she holds a BA in Biblical Studies, a BS in Psychology, Master's in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, and a PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision. Before we get to that, let me mention all of the new patrons that have jumped on board: Mario, Rob, Chloe, Darren, Mark, and Shannon. Thanks, you guys. I appreciate your support very much, and hopefully you can make the most of your membership by joining us over at Satanic Delco and throwing yourself in the mix with everyone. We've been having a pretty good time lately. I'm going to save the listener mail for today, so if you have a moment out there, please visit our website at hailsatanpodcast.com. You can join up with us on social media there. There's a form on the website to send your emails, which of course you should do immediately. Send me some feedback on the show or suggestions or whatever you want to do. And of course, there's a button on there to join us on Patreon. There's a few tiers with various benefits and discounts, and any of them will open the door to Satanic Delco for you. Okay, we are now joined by Dr. Hannah Bland. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thanks.
So I discovered you by chance online when I saw a seminar you were doing recently called The Satanic Panic: Understanding the Role of the Mental Health Professional.
Yeah, I actually did that last Thursday.
Okay. How did it go?
It actually went really well. I've been talking about Satanism with mental health professionals for a little while now, and I've gotten really mixed reactions. For this occasion, everyone that attended was really interested. They were open to the idea. There were a couple people that had some concerns about it, but once they understood what Satanism was and what I was trying to accomplish, they were generally pretty open-minded.
You would imagine these are people that weren't really familiar with modern Satanism generally?
Yeah. What I've found is that most mental health professionals aren't really aware of modern Satanism or what it really means to be a Satanist.
Do you identify as a Satanist?
Yeah, I actually do. So when I was first interested in Satanism, it was purely professional. I had a lot of interest in religion and religious plurality and how we can utilize religion as a way to increase access to mental health services and integrating religion and spirituality. But I was also kind of going on my own kind of religious and spiritual journey. And it just so happened that as I learned more about Satanism, I found that it was really the perfect fit for me.
Did religion play much of a role in your upbringing?
Interestingly, it did. And as I got older, I had become more involved with religion. There was actually a period of time where I was very much a devoted Christian. And I just found that things didn't really align. The God that I had been told about and that I was supposed to believe in didn't really line up with my values of kindness and benevolence and empathy. And it wasn't who I was anymore.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty common story, I guess. At least a person in my position hears a lot of these stories, so it seems like a pretty common one.
Yeah.
How did Satanism first appear to you?
Satanism first popped onto my radar thanks to LaVey's The Satanic Bible, as I think it does probably for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I first saw the Satanic Bible, And I picked it up and I read through it super quickly. And I found that it was interesting and it said a lot of things that felt like they were on the right path, but they weren't necessarily me. So by chance, not long after that, I was on my honeymoon. I got married on Halloween last year, and we went up to Salem to spend the week, and I ended up going to the Satanic temple there and absolutely fell in love. And kind of from that moment, I knew Satanism was home for me and TST was the right place.
Yeah, that's fun. Most people that I've ever spoken to, they don't get the chance to be sort of turned on to the Satanic temple right from the source. You know, most people stumble upon the documentary or find the 7 Tenets online, but that's pretty cool that you got to go check it out.
Yeah, it was a great experience.
You're probably aware of all of the work that TST has been trying to do with their gray faction, related mostly to the repressed memories and the satanic ritual abuse stuff. How do you feel about that work that they're doing?
I think it's absolutely incredible work. And I love that TST is doing that work. It is disappointing in a lot of ways that work isn't coming from the mental health community itself. But one thing I've been really interested in is really trying to integrate some of the work that TST and the Gray Faction are doing into my professional work. So with the webinar I did last week, we talked a lot about repressed memories and false memory formation and how these things can occur. And we talked about satanic ritual abuse and some of the ways that as mental health providers during the Satanic Panic, we really used approaches that were not scientifically validated. We did things that were unethical and really in a lot of ways manipulative and weren't appropriate for our professional status. So I think TST is doing really great work, and I hope it's something that as providers we pick up on and we start doing more of ourselves.
Is there much discussion in your field of work or amongst your colleagues about that era of the practice and you know, the fallout from all of that stuff?
There's actually no talk about it, which is, again, disappointing.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, it's really easy to say that was our past, that was our history, it's not where we are now. So we focus more on the present and what we're doing now in terms of theory and technique. So there's really not much talk about the ways in which we caused damage and how we really need to make amends for that. So at least in my experience, when people start talking about satanic ritual abuse and the Satanic Panic, the first time they're talking about it is with me, and they're really surprised and floored that mental health providers had such a big impact during that time period.
Is it generally considered that that stuff is in the past, or is there a concern that some of it is still happening?
The general consensus has been that that stuff is in the past. Typically when we talk about things like hypnosis, which like with Michelle Remembers, that was a huge piece.
Yeah.
Dr. Padser said, oh, I did hypnosis, found all these repressed memories. Typically now it's kind of a joke, like, oh, that's something we used to do back in the day, but it's not practiced now. But I think the unfortunate reality is that we still have fringe groups that are absolutely engaging in these kinds of things. We have groups that still see repressed memories as reality. We have people that truly believe in satanic ritual abuse and mind control. So we really need to do better as a profession in weeding out these individuals and gatekeeping to ensure that they're not harming people.
Is there any sort of gatekeeping in place? I mean, I assume that those folks, those professionals that are approaching those issues in those ways, are they graduating with the same degrees that you are and other therapists are, and then just sort of taking that on somehow as their own version of it?
Yeah, so the gatekeeping within the mental health profession is pretty interesting, and it varies a little bit depending on what sector you fall under. So for me, I'm a professional counselor, but we also have social workers and psychologists. So we all do the same kinds of things, but the programs we go through are just slightly different. But in terms of these individuals, like, yes, they're going through these same programs we are, they're getting the same education. Now, certainly some of these individuals are older, so the programs might have adapted over time, but they still had to go through the same practicums and internship hours. They still had to be supervised by someone. For counselors, even after you graduate a master's program, you have to go through 2 years of additional supervision before you're independently licensed. And then after that is where we typically start to see problems. So through your master's program, you have people watching you. And then 2 years post, you have people making sure you're on track. You're not doing wild things. You're not saying things like, satanic ritual abuse is occurring. But then after that, unless someone reports you to an ethics board, there's really not much in the way of oversight. It's really left to other professionals to say, hey, this person is doing something really fucked up and we need to report it.
Yeah. And that kind of behavior, one of these people that are practicing in that way, focusing on the satanic ritual abuse or repressed memories, they're going through the same programs. Do you suspect that they're just sort of keeping that stuff quiet until they don't have to anymore? Or I just wonder how someone can go through their traditional schooling and have none of this be a problem. And then once they're free and unleashed on the world, all of a sudden they start doing this. I wonder if they're just keeping their mouth shut to get by until nobody's looking. But again,
Right.
I can't understand that.
Right. No, it's wild. How does none of this slip up through an entire graduate program?
Yeah.
And I think it is possible that people can kind of tuck some of these things away because they know people who are ethical providers are going to say that's not appropriate. We're not going to handle people like that. But I also think there's this tendency to say, oh, well, if we provide more education, if we give them more time, people can grow out of some of these beliefs. I haven't seen it specific to, satanic ritual abuse or anything like that, but I have certainly seen moments where people have said, this individual has some ideas that aren't quite reflective of the profession, but it's because they're young. They're still growing in a sense. They're still gaining insight and self-awareness. And if we allow them through this process, through continued supervision, they'll figure it out. And some people genuinely do. They grow. And then other people don't. And that's where we really fail as a profession to say, you had your chance and now you're done.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that seminar that you did and sort of brush over what was included or what you focused on?
Yeah, sure. So it was an hour and a half, so I'll be really brief. So we really started by talking about a lot of the factors that led up to the satanic panic and what constitutes a moral panic, which certainly the satanic panic was. So we talked a lot about, serial killers and cults in the 60s and 70s, creating a lot of fear. There was a lot of occult symbolism used, and that got connected very quickly to Satanism. And then we also had LaVey in 69, who published the Satanic Bible. We also were in the Reagan era, where conservative Christianity really reigned as supreme. There was this focus on Christian values and maintaining traditional family values in America. But then we also had some really wild things happening, like Dungeons and Dragons came out in 74, and there was this huge Christian panic about kids playing Dungeons and Dragons. And all of this stuff really primed us for when Michelle Remembers came out in 1980, where Patzer said, through hypnosis, the 600 hours plus of hypnosis, we now have proof of satanic ritual abuse. which is wild because none of it ever happened. Michelle's memories were not accurate. Many people said that they never even happened, that they were using this as an excuse to spend time together, because they did end up divorcing their partners and getting married, saying they were soulmates, which you should never, ever sleep with or marry your clients. Like, I hope people know that at this point. So we talked about that. And then also the McMartin preschool trial, which was wild in and of itself. And a lot of the techniques used by Key McFarland, and she was the social worker, she did a lot of the interviews with the kids. And a lot of the coercion and manipulation and the tactics she used to get these false confessions from kids, she was really brilliant when it came to utilizing authority figures. So she would say things to kids like, well, your mom and dad already know this abuse happened, or all the other kids told me that the abuse happened. Don't you want to tell me? Don't you want to be like the other kids? And these leading statements, these leading questions were the reasons that we got these false confessions from kids. She also used things like ugly dolls to describe the individuals who were accused of sexual assaulting these kids. She also used anatomically correct dolls with erect penises. She did wild things to get these confessions, and none of it ever occurred. So we talked a lot about that, and as providers, what we need to be doing differently, what we need to watch out for. And then we ended just by talking about what Satanism really is, because I think it's one thing to talk about what the panic was and what it wasn't. But then providers also need to understand that Satanists are not out there sacrificing babies. Like, we are not killing your kids. You know, I've never sacrificed a goat. And we're actually just solid human beings trying to live in the world. So I think overall it went really well, and people were very receptive to it.
And the audience for that was primarily other mental health professionals.
Yeah, so it was sponsored by the National Board of Forensic Evaluators. So everyone that was participating was either a forensic evaluator or they were connected to the NBFE in some way.
Right.
So psychologists, social workers, counselors.
Have you ever experienced any clearly negative backlash or anything like that from colleagues?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I had to think about it for a moment, because it's never really been direct towards me. It's always been kind of in a roundabout way, which I find very interesting. So for this past webinar that I did, there were some individuals who were concerned. They did email the NBFE and raise concerns about talking about Satanism, and they were Christians. So there was concern on their end as a Christian whether or not a organization should be talking about Satanism. And then I had presented at another conference here in West Virginia, and by and far, everyone was wonderful. People came up, they talked to me afterwards. I went out to dinner to talk with people about it afterwards. But I did have an individual come up, and she was like, I've been wanting to talk to you this whole conference, but I couldn't because my boss who's with me is a very conservative Christian, and she didn't want me talking to you. So that was interesting. So no one's ever come out directly and said, like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Right.
But certainly there have been side comments that let me know counselors aren't always as open and non-judgmental as we should be.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to avoid the reality that people's religion is a thing that they sometimes, often, take pretty seriously.
Yeah.
And so I guess, the folks that are Christians and really have a deeply held belief in that direction, I guess it's understandable that they might feel some concern, but at the same time, unfortunate and slightly disappointing that it would work itself out that way.
Yeah, super disappointing. And I think it's even more disappointing when you're looking in the mental health profession or a health profession in general, because we really do have these ethical codes, and we talk about self-awareness where it is being able to separate yourself and your personal beliefs from your practice. You don't have to agree with everyone that you see for therapy. And if your beliefs don't align, that's okay. It's not about you, it's about them. So I think a lot of people are still figuring out how to put their personal beliefs aside to provide quality care to people.
Yeah. A big moment for a lot of Satanists is that moment when they finally have built up the courage to talk to their friends or their family and sort of come out as a Satanist. And often enough, the stories I hear from people is that doesn't always go so well. In fact, it seems like most of the time it doesn't go so well.
Right.
And these are, people who are close to them and supposed to be the ones that love and support the person, and they have this negative reaction. Is there any type of general advice you might be able to give to a person who is preparing to have that talk, or even for someone who's had the talk and had it not go so well?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I think the biggest thing is just keeping that mindset that the only thing you can control is yourself and the way you respond to these situations. We can hope the best for other people and we can want to believe that they will respond positively. But if they don't, that's okay. And that's not on you. Your response to that is on you. But if they don't respond in a good way, it's okay. It doesn't change who you are as a human being, and it doesn't invalidate who you are. So I think a lot of it is also dependent on your family structure and who you're trying to tell. If you have a really healthy family system, it might be that they just need some time to process and they need some education on what Satanism is. Because when you bring up the idea of Satan or Satanism, people generally don't know what you mean, or their only understanding of it is coming from something they saw on TV, or they watched an episode of Criminal Minds where somebody was a Satanist. So I think giving family and friends time to process that and helping them understand what it is. But also, if you're coming from an environment that's toxic, they may never understand that. And you being able to set boundaries for yourself is going to be huge. So making sure that your mental health comes first. So if they're very toxic and they're very negative, they're very harmful about it, if they're making jabs over dinner about it, you have to be really clear and say to that individual, we can't talk about this, or I don't like when you make those comments and I'm not going to be accepting of that. And you really have to follow through with that, because at the end of the day, it really is ensuring that you're healthy, and sometimes family isn't healthiest for us.
Yeah, most people are going to have that initial reaction. And I suppose a lot of that reaction, especially, if you're a person in your 20s or 30s, certainly your parents probably experienced through pop culture some level of that satanic panic stuff. And that's probably all of the education they've ever had to inform their idea of what they think Satanism is.
Yeah.
And so when you say, I'm into Satanism, they have this terrible idea of what you've just said to them. They certainly probably have never heard of the 7 tenets or maybe even the Satanic Temple, and they don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
Probably some time and some education would go as far as anything.
Absolutely. And I think also just remembering where your family is coming from. If you're coming from a very conservative Christian family, their response might be very different. And if they're relying very heavily on their pastor's influence, which not all Christians are bad and not all pastors are bad, but certainly there are sects of Christianity which are very harmful and very toxic. So just being mindful of what position they're coming from and being realistic in how you expect them to respond.
Yeah. So ahead of our chat over the last week, I reached out to my group, Satanic Delco, and Instagram and everything to see if anyone had any questions to ask a Satan-friendly therapist. And so we have a bunch of those. And if you want, we can get into some of those.
Yeah, sure.
We've got number one. One of the reasons more people don't seek out a mental health professional is because of how much it costs, especially for those without insurance. What can be done to make mental health care more affordable?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it really speaks to a larger issue within our society. Healthcare in general is not affordable. Unfortunately, whether we're looking at medical care or mental health care, it's a luxury in a lot of senses. And mental health care, even more so, you can, in most cases, survive without mental health care. You might not be surviving well or thriving, but you can. But if your leg is broken, you have to go get medical care.
Yeah.
So I think it really speaks to a larger issue. It's about, talking to legislators. How do we feel about universal health care? Larger things like that are going to take time and are going to take a lot of legislative efforts and having the right people in the positions of power. But in the meantime, there are things that we can do to make mental health care more affordable to people, because as providers, we recognize it's expensive to come to counseling. It's not just a time commitment, it's a financial commitment. So when people are looking for providers, off the bat, ask if they have a sliding scale. So most providers have some kind of system in place that if you are in a financial crunch and you can't afford the services, but you need them, we can change our pay scale. We call it a sliding scale. Yeah. So if you come in and maybe our out-of-pocket expense is $60 and you say, I can't do that, I can only do 10, we can adjust our pay scale to make sure you're getting those services. You just have to talk to us. Most people, if they have websites, they list whether or not they have a sliding scale. Yeah. But also before you go in and you put money out of pocket for that first appointment, when you're on the phone with them, you can ask, do you have a sliding scale? Is that available to me? There's also an option, at least for counselors, we do have an ethical code that says, hey, you should really offer pro bono services from time to time to make sure you're getting everybody in your community, because some people just simply can't afford it. So ask your providers if they're doing pro bono services at that time, or if there's a wait list for pro bono services. Certainly we can't have everybody free of charge, but for some people, they'll have one or two people on their caseload at a time or throughout the year that are pro bono cases. Yeah. We also have the other really less talked about option. Ethically, we are allowed to barter services. So we don't do it often because it can be tricky, but in some cases, if you as the client have a service I'm in need of, we can exchange those. So there have been cases where, someone with really great carpentry skills has come in, they don't have the money to pay, but they're saying, hey, I can put new flooring down in your office if that needs done. And you exchange services that way rather than monetary exchange.
That's great. It would never even occur to me, personally, if I were looking for services, it would never have occurred to me to really think to ask upfront about something like pro bono services or bartering in some way. That's pretty great.
Yeah, and a lot of people just don't know that it's a possibility. And unfortunately, on our end, we don't talk about it too often, but these are absolutely options. So if your provider isn't bringing it up to you, just ask.
Yeah.
The other options, they're really area dependent in a lot of ways, but look and see if your area is a college town. look and see if they have a counseling department. Some departments are really great and they have counseling clinics. So they have entire training programs set up on the campus that provide free services to the community. So you come in, you get free counseling services. The exchange is that you're letting a practicum or intern do those services, someone who's currently in their master's program.
Right.
Someone is supervising them, someone is watching over to make sure they're providing competent services, but you're still able to get free access to care, which is really great.
Yeah, that is pretty great.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion of these? I've not experienced any of them, but I've seen some of these services where there's like an app or a website where you can just sort of sign up and be assigned a virtual counselor.
Yeah, so those have been on the radar for a while, but certainly when COVID-19 hit, they exploded, and a lot of therapists who were doing face-to-face services switched over to these online platforms to make sure they could provide continuity of care.
Yeah.
So I personally didn't have the opportunity to do those kinds of services working in a prison. Incarceration did not stop because of the pandemic, so I still came to work every day.
Sure.
But I think they can be really beneficial for a lot of different reasons. One, some people don't have transportation to get to therapy, or they might be in really rural areas and the closest provider is an hour or two away. So having a virtual option is really great. My only drawback is that certainly I feel like when you're just texting a therapist rather than seeing that person face to face, some of the essence of therapy is lost. A lot of therapy is connecting with that person, being able to see their nonverbals, and you lose some of that through technology.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced a bit of that intent and tone sort of being lost in the black and white of text.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Number 2, how should people approach or disengage from friends or family members who make a habit out of using mental health as an excuse for abusive behavior?
Yeah. So this one is interesting because it can go a couple of different ways. So there are different kinds of abuse, and I would tackle all of these differently. So if this individual is physically abusive, certainly I would say it might not be best to confront this individual at all. Just disengage, create that hard boundary for yourself. Say, I'm going to, take this person off of my social media accounts. I'm going to block their number if that's possible. If it's someone that you don't have to have continued contact with, make that hard boundary. Keeping yourself safe is the ultimate priority. I would also certainly, if this is someone that you have concerns about your overall safety, let someone else know that you're trying to change this relationship or end this relationship. So in case something would go wrong, someone knows what's happening. They know where you are and what to look for. If this is someone who is not putting your physical safety in risk, it's a little bit different. And it depends on what you actually want out of this relationship. Do you want to try to mend it, or are you just looking for closure? So if possible, you can have that conversation with them. You can say, this is how you harmed me. These are the behaviors you've engaged in that have hurt me. And this is what I need to happen in order for our relationship to maintain or to repair. And from there, it's absolutely on them. You can't have a healthy relationship if only one person is working. So if it hits that point where you've laid out what you need and you've set these boundaries, and they're simply not willing to abide by it, and they keep pushing those boundaries every chance they get, that's your sign to end that relationship. But maybe it also happens that they decide to start working on things, and then you can be a support system for them. But certainly mental health is never an excuse to engage in toxic behaviors or to be abusive, to treat someone poorly. Many of us struggle with mental health, and it doesn't mean that we become bad people. That's really just an excuse.
Yeah. I guess that sort of works the same for any type of relationship you could find yourself in. If the bad outweighs the good, or however you want to measure that, you get to a point where you make the decision as to whether or not you can continue being involved with it at all.
Right, because sometimes the healthiest thing is to simply disengage. And it's not that it won't hurt. It's not that you won't miss that person. It's not that they weren't an important aspect of your life, but it's they can no longer be part of your life if you want to be healthy. So you have to determine for yourself when that ending point is.
Yeah. Okay, the next one says, how does one find a Satanist-friendly therapist? Especially in grief counseling, it's important that your beliefs align, and it's been hard for me to find someone. Just shopping around can be expensive.
Yeah. So first, shopping around is super expensive. It is not cheap to try out therapists. Typically, those first appointments cost way more than the standard session because intake sessions are just more expensive. So I could see how it would be difficult to keep trying out therapists. What I would recommend is that when you're searching for a therapist, if they have a website, they typically provide their areas of expertise on that website so you know whether or not this person is going to be a good fit for you. So they might have, hashtags or headlines that talk about, religion or spirituality. They might not specifically say Satanist, but they'll say something to the effect of, competent in religion and spirituality. If they don't, but they seem like someone who might be really great for your specific needs, like grief counseling or trauma, whatever it is, you can always send them an email and you can ask questions. It's almost like an interview process in a lot of ways. And that's how I want people to look at it. Like, I want you to come see me, but I have to impress you. I have to convince you that I'm worth your time and money. So ask those questions, send them an email or set up a phone call. Ask that individual, how comfortable are you with different religions? What courses have you taken? Have you heard of Satanism before? And what are your experiences with it? And if that individual is very standoffish about it, they're not the right person.
Yeah.
But if they're willing to have that conversation, that's a good sign. Outside of that, there isn't any list that provides Satan-friendly therapists or therapists who are friendly towards religious minorities. What there is a group within the ACA, the American Counseling Association, and it's called ACERVIC. And if you go on their website, it's under the American Counseling Association. They do have a lot of information about religion and spirituality for counselors, and some of them have individual state groups. If you reach out to that state organization, they might be able to connect you with a therapist that suits your needs and that's more comfortable working with someone who's of a non-dominant religion.
Okay, great. The next one asks, in addition to the Satanic Panic found memory therapist convincing patients that they've been falsely harmed, does the inverse exist, convincing patients that they haven't been harmed when they actually have? And what are some potential red flags to look for in a psychiatrist with an agenda? So
I'll break down into two parts. So I'll start with, the Satanic Panic bit of it. I can't think of a time where I have ever seen a professional trying to intentionally harm their client or convince their client that no harm has occurred. what I have seen is that people unintentionally minimize what someone has been through. It's not that they're trying to minimize that. They're not trying to say this event has not occurred to you, but they're really focused on things like positive psychology. And a big focus of positive psychology is, well, focusing on the positive, being present and focusing on what you can control, looking towards things in a healthier manner, reframing things to the positive. It's kind of like finding the silver lining in everything. And I've seen that there are times where people who are very focused on this type of therapy, they tend to push away the bad things that happen to people. So they'll say things like, well, let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the good, or what good did you get out of this? But the reality is sometimes there isn't good in a situation. Sometimes it just really fucking sucks. Sometimes the things we've experienced are just really painful. And we have to sit with that. We have to be present with that. And we have to experience it before we can move on. So I've seen instances like that. I've also seen other therapy modalities where it's just not designed to talk about trauma or negative experiences. So short-term therapies like reality therapy, some cognitive behavioral therapies, they're very short-term. They can be crunched down to 6 to 10 weeks. So individuals will say things like, let's focus on your current thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We're not going to talk about the negative. We're not going to talk about how you got here or the painful experiences. So in that way, I have seen people, in a sense, say harm has not occurred, or at the very least, we're not going to bring that up here.
Right.
And that doesn't always work.
Is it possible that, depending on the approach of the therapist, like you mentioned, there are these different approaches that people could take. Maybe through some of those different approaches, the patient might get the impression that the therapist maybe isn't taking it as seriously, or, they're just feeling different levels of intensity or importance about these events.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important if a client is feeling that way, if you're sitting with your therapist and you're like, this individual is not getting it, or I feel really hurt that they're minimizing this, or I feel that they are, let them know. I wish we had a crystal ball and we could read minds. It would make our jobs way easier, but we don't. And sometimes we miss things. We're fallible. So if we've hurt you, or you're feeling that we've missed something, or we're minimizing something important, just tell us. We can stop. Any good therapist is going to apologize and say, I'm so sorry. How do we work to mend this? How can I be better? What have I done specifically to make sure I don't do this again?
Yeah.
So that can happen. So if you're looking for something that's maybe more long-term, or that's going to focus more on maybe traumatic events, or, maybe there was a series of events that occurred, you might not want to focus on something like cognitive behavioral therapies or short-term therapies. They might not give you what you need. So you can also ask your provider what their orientation is and how they approach therapy before your first session, so you know if that's the right fit.
Great. The next one asks, what are your views on psychedelics as a form of therapy for depression or other mental health struggles?
Yeah, so I have a professional view and then a personal view. So I do have to separate the two.
Sure.
So certainly when I hear the term self-medicate, I get a little bit concerned because typically when we say self-medicate, it's in a very negative connotation. I've never heard anybody come to me and say I'm self-medicating and it turn out well. Typically when they say I'm self-medicating, it's going down a very dark path, and that's why they're there to see me. But I do think there's potential for psychedelics and other alternative medicines. So professionally, I tell everyone those are not legal at this time, so I can't condone that. Also, certainly working in a prison, I tell anyone if you're getting out and you're going to be on parole, you cannot use psychedelics. I don't care if you think they're good for trauma. You can't do it because you could risk going to jail. And nobody's mental health improves in jail. So I think there's that concern of it's not whether or not they're helpful, it's whether or not they're legal. So I would never condone anything that's currently illegal. But there are some really interesting clinical trials happening with psychedelics. And they've found really amazing results for things like PTSD and major depressive disorder. We've seen significant improvement that's as good or better than the major drugs we're using right now to treat them. So the hope is that best case scenario, we're looking at FDA approval by 2023 for psychedelics as a form of treatment. A lot of this will be dependent on continued clinical trials and being able to expand those, but certainly there's potential. And even things like ayahuasca, there's a lot of really good things that are happening and many personal stories where people are coming out and saying, nothing has ever helped my trauma, but I started taking ayahuasca and suddenly it's like all the trauma got purged from my body. So certainly there's potential, but I would never want anyone taking something that could wind them in jail or prison.
Yeah, this is a topic I specifically am fascinated by and have a personal interest in, but there has been a lot of promising work being done. I know Johns Hopkins has a whole psychedelic research unit that they've had going for a few years now, and it seems like things are moving in a promising direction.
Yeah, it's really hopeful because we've seen, on and off for decades where there's been promising research, but nothing's ever really come from it. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There's still stigma around psychedelics, but also big pharma makes a lot of money off of current medications. So I think there's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
But certainly I think it is hopeful to think that in the next, 3 to 5 years, we could have some form of psychedelics available to the public for mental health treatment.
Yeah. I guess slowly but surely it seems like things are, loosening around that. I know some cities around the country have now decriminalized psychedelics also. So I guess it's all slowly moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's similar to, marijuana in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It would. And in a lot of places, it's still illegal. It's still criminalized, which personally I think is crazy. But there was a lot of stigma around it. And slowly we're seeing improvements in that. And we're seeing the benefits of marijuana use. So I think psychedelics are going to follow a similar path.
Do you have any advice for being in a relationship with someone whose beliefs don't align with your own?
Yeah, absolutely. So for sure, when you're looking at relationships, I would say that they're most likely to work when you have a compatible foundation. So it's not that you have to have everything in common. That's never going to happen. You're going to have differences, but you want to make sure that those foundational beliefs are similar, or at least they're areas that are not deal breakers. So if you're in a relationship with someone who has differences, have those honest conversations and have them early on. The last thing you want to see, and I have seen this time and time again when I used to work with families, is that they wouldn't talk about their religious beliefs or their political beliefs, which is crazy to me. But they wouldn't talk about these things. They would get years into a relationship and they would realize that they were bitter rivals in a lot of ways. So stopping to have those conversations early. Talk about religion. Talk about kids. Do you want them? Do you like kids? What if you end up pregnant? Are you okay with abortion? What do you think about adoption? All of these things really need to be laid out early so there are no surprises later in the relationship. And if you find that there's middle ground and you can both be okay with each other, perfect. But if not, you really need to evaluate if this relationship is worth your time. Is this something that you want to invest in, knowing that this individual might never change? Because sometimes we go into relationships with the idea of, oh, I can change this person or I can fix them. Or if they spend more time with me, they'll come over to my side. I've seen this a lot with religion, which again, almost never works. So never go into it with saying, I can fix this person, because you are going to just fuck yourself over. But if you have these conversations, you can avoid the pain, you can avoid the suffering, or you can find out that you have more in common than you realized. So just have the honest conversations early and decide if it's what you want or not.
Do you ever run into a client that you work with? You know, I've definitely heard these stories where people might be in a long-term relationship or married even, and years into this experience, they discover, oh, my spouse has these religious or political views that don't align with me. Like, it's shocking. Like, what have you been talking about for the last 8 years? How has it never come up?
Right. That always baffles me. And for me, like, I'm a pretty curious human being. So I always ask, I'm like, well, what do you mean you didn't know this? So I asked him, I'm like, well, what have you been doing for the past 25 years that you didn't know that he was a conservative Christian and he supported Trump? How did you not know this?
Yeah.
Like, what have you been doing? So I think a lot of it is, I see this happen frequently with individuals who, and nothing against this, it can work for some people, but people who get married very young or very quickly, and people who have children very quickly after getting into a relationship, because they're not really taking the time to explore one another. Once you have a kid, hopefully, your focus is on raising a healthy, productive member of society. So your focus really shifts away from the relationship for a period and shifts onto that child or children. And then as your kiddo gets older, you realize, I don't know a damn thing about the person I'm married to. And that's when they start finding out all of these things they don't actually like about the other person. And in those cases, I've seen couples where they divorce. You know, if I am doing marriage therapy with someone, I always tell them my goal is not to make sure you stay together. My goal is to make sure you're both healthy and happy. And sometimes that means divorce. Yeah. So sometimes it ends up with them saying, this isn't who I am anymore. You know, you were good for a period. There was a point in my life where this was what I needed, but I've changed as a human being and I need to move on to something different. And that's okay. But there are other times where it's just helping them connect again and figure out who they are as individuals, but also together. So it really depends on the couple.
Yeah, I think often enough when people do, particularly when there's an unplanned pregnancy, maybe early in a relationship, enough people just sort of default to, well, I guess we're going to be together then.
Right.
You know, whether or not we really know each other that well, we're stuck now.
Right. And that's absolutely not the case. Yeah. I think a lot of that is, maybe indoctrination is too strong of a word, but it's what I'm going to go with. I think a lot of it is indoctrination. You know, getting pregnant out of wedlock is bad. If that happens, you need to get married. You need to have a stable life. Your kid needs to see you're married. But that's not true at all. What your kid needs to see is two healthy, happy people who are there to support that child, whether it's together or separate.
Yeah, it does seem to be the societal default, even in this day and age. So, Okay, we've got one that asks, I was raised Roman Catholic, and even though I haven't been practicing for over a decade, I still can't shake the irrational fear of hell. Is there anything I can do to overcome this fear?
Yeah, so it's interesting because this isn't the first time I've heard someone say something like that. I think it's actually more common than this person might realize when someone is leaving a very strong community with very strong beliefs of any kind. It doesn't even necessarily have to be religious, but when you're leaving a specific group of people who have very hard set values and their job, in a sense, is to teach those to you, it can be very hard to shake those, even if it's been years since you followed that path. So, certainly with Catholicism, there is this very strong belief in heaven or hell, good versus evil, and it's frequently taught. So, it can be that decades later, this irrational fear pops up and you're left wondering, like, oh my God, am I going to hell? And you're not, you know better.
Yeah.
But the brain is really interesting in that it can have this irrational belief in one corner, but then rationality comes up against it. And those two start to fight in a sense. We call it cognitive dissonance, these two opposing ideas really wrestling for your attention. So, one thing that I do when people are really struggling with this dissonance or they have this irrational fear of any kind that keeps popping up is really start tracking what's going on around you when these irrational fears or these irrational thoughts are popping up. Typically, we find that they're not coming out of nowhere. Something is triggering this thought process for us. We're often just unaware of what's occurring in our environment. So maybe you find that there are specific people or specific conversations. There might be specific places you go and this pops up for you. Track those and figure out what they are. It might be as simple as avoiding a certain place if you can, but also it might be that you can't avoid this person or thing. So it's just being able to have some kind of challenging statement to give back to that. When your mind says to you, you're going to go to hell, it's being able to almost have that argument and say, here's my rationale for why that's not the case. And over time, we find that when people can consistently almost argue that out with themselves, the thought tends to pop in less often, or when it does, it's not as intense. But also, there's no set timeline on when these things disappear. So for some people, it might last a couple of months. For this individual, it's a decade. There's no right or wrong. It's just based on those potential triggers.
Maybe even a person with a great foundation of science, or even just a casual understanding. And, as Satanists, we have certain beliefs and definitely don't have other certain beliefs. But at the end of the day, people can always have a basic fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
And something like, the existence of hell or an afterlife or something like that. All of us sort of have this accepted belief that that's not really a thing, but it's also one of those areas where I don't know if science can ever absolutely disprove it to those of us in the land of the living.
Yeah. And I think that's for most people, Satanist or not, the unknown is pretty scary. It provokes anxiety. So it's okay if that thought pops in from time to time, as long as it's not overwhelming you, as long as it's not impairing your ability to function. If you can challenge that thought and put it aside, that's okay. Most people are experiencing that at some point in their lives.
Yeah. Well, Hannah, this has been really cool of you to do, and I appreciate you taking the time to answer all these questions.
No problem.
Is there anything that you want people to know, or a place where people can find you if they want to find you?
Sure. So if you want to reach out to me, the easiest way is by email. So I'll give you my personal one. So my email is hannah period FRYZEL at yahoo.com. If you have any questions, comments, anything that we didn't get to today, shoot me an email. I will get back to you. I'll make sure that we can set up a time to talk. I love talking about these things, but also ask people in your communities, if there are mental health providers in your community or agencies you know of, ask them if they're interested in learning or what resources they have. I'm really open to talking with the mental health profession, and sometimes it's just having a foot in that door. So feel free to reach out, contact me at any time, and it's been great being here.
Cool. I will share your email with the group, and if people have questions, they'll contact you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
All right. Bye.
All right, guys. That's all I've got for you this week. Please stop by hailsatanpodcast.com and drop me a line. Stay safe out there, please. Hail Satan.
He will free service.